Good evening. Welcome again to Biblical Insights with Bob. This evening we're looking at a story from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and it's a story about Jacob. I've titled it Walking with a Limp, and maybe you can already guess what it's about, but I want to read that portion of Jacob's story, starting in chapter 32 of Genesis. So read along with me now as we go there to read. So the present passed on before him, while he himself spent the night in that camp. So he rose that same night and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford at Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and he sent across whatever else they had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh, so that the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blessed them there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." Now here's the text, verse number 31. Now the sun rose upon him as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. History is replete with Christians that God has used in a mighty way, in spite of various types of handicaps. We might also say they walked with a limp, might we? Think about it. Remember Johnny Erickson Tata, Fanny Crosby, the blind songwriter who wrote so many beautiful songs, Uncle Bud Robinson, who never went to school, talked with a tremendous stutter, and even going back to the New Testament, we mentioned the Apostle Paul, who had a thorn in the flesh that kept him humble. He speaks about it in his first letter to the Corinthians and says that God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake." Here's the key: for when I'm weak, then I am strong. Now, the Hebrew word even for faith, which is emunah, is closely related to spiritual weakness. The Bible uses a number of synonyms for spiritual weakness. These are words often used in the book of Isaiah and the Beatitudes. For example, the words like poor or poor in spirit, or lowly in spirit, or brokenhearted, humble, several of them, mourner, hungry for righteousness. These are synonyms that indicate that the true people of God are those who realize that by ourselves we're nothing. They have nothing and they can do nothing unless God enables them. Only when we admit our inability and our weakness can we really live a life of victory. But not only must we be aware of our absolute weakness in His sight, we've got to see it as a form of a blessing. Now, many people have weaknesses, but we consider them a curse. But I like that statement. Let me say it again. We must not only be aware of our total weakness, but we have to see it as a form of a blessing. Now, I've just done a message on here on Hebrews 11, and I've always called that passage the Hall of Faith. But part of it says, whose weakness was turned into strength and became powerful in battle and routed foreign enemies. Weakness turned into faith. So now we're looking at the story of Jacob. Jacob was a self-centered man, you might say. I think he thought he was strong. I think he could handle everything. But there's a sense in which the story of Jacob is a story of every one of us who follow Jesus Christ. There's a sense in which all of us have to walk with a limp. So let's look a little closer at the narrative from Genesis. I've already mentioned that Jacob was self-sufficient up to this point. The very word Jacob means supplanter, and a lot of times in Scripture he's called a schemer. You see, he had tricked his father and his brother. In verse 9 of the chapter we just read, he makes a statement, with staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. So there's a sense of pride in that. Most of us can identify with this self-sufficiency. We want to be in control. Look at the patriarchs who had their common lot with this characteristic. Even Abram, when he went to Egypt, he lied about Sarah, saying that she was his sister because she was beautiful, and he didn't want the Pharaoh to get any ideas about her. Isaac, when he desired to bless Esau, even though Jacob had told Rebekah that the youngest would be blessed above the elder, it all seemed so right according to traditions, but they all had these faults, you see. Jacob loved Rachel more than he did Leah. That's who he first saw on his when he went to his father-in-law's land. But God chose to bless Leah with the line of the Messiah. They all had limps. Yet there seems to be a sense of helplessness or worthlessness of the flesh. Jacob knew that Esau was coming after him with 400 men. You know, with that kind of an army, all the possessions and cattle and servants and wives and children could have been swept away by Esau's revenge. Even in this situation, he tries to appease him by sending gifts in waves or droves, as it were, still trying to do it his way. But God, as always, had a better way. Then Jacob was left alone after his wife and all his family had crossed the river Jabbok. In fact, the very name Jabbok, the river, means empty. Can you imagine him sitting there at night by himself? He had to be in some distress. He was alone with these thoughts and alone with God. You know what? To be left alone with God is the only way to come to a true knowledge of ourselves. No matter what we might think about ourselves, the great question is, what does God think of me? And the answer to this question only learned when we're left alone. Here alone, we can get a true picture of ourselves. So he wrestled with this man. Now, notice that it doesn't say Jacob wrestled with a man, but the man wrestled with him. Now, the reason this man was wrestling with Jacob was to bring him to a sense of his own weakness. He had to bring Jacob to the point of realizing his own worthlessness in order to teach him, and us, by the way, the all-important lesson that recognizes that our weakness lies in our strength. When we think we're strong, we're really weak. So he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh and dislocated it while he wrestled with him. In one touch, he brought Jacob to this point of absolute helplessness. In an instant, Jacob's power to keep fighting was gone. He came to the end of his own resources. Now, this is the purpose God has for us when he's dealing with us. He has to bring us to the end of ourselves to show us our powerlessness. No longer could he wrestle. Verse 26 says all he could do was hang on. Now, always before, Jacob had tried to run his own life, planning, scheming. Remember, even to his father, he put goat skin on the back of his neck because Esau was hairy and he wasn't. Now he comes to the point where he can only say, I won't let you go. I won't let you go. That's what he said to the angel. This was a new era in the life of Job. But notice that it wasn't until he was brought to this point when he realized his own helplessness. So at Peniel, Jacob was so desperate, so afraid of what his brother would do to him the next day, that he refused to go on without meeting the Lord. In so many words, he said, I can't face tomorrow without you, Lord. This was the beginning of his dependence on God and the beginning of victory for him. He went away from that meeting limping, but spiritually, he was a new and a stronger man. When was the last time you struggled? Maybe late at night or during the night, only to come to the point where all you could do was to let go and hang on. The angel changed his name at that point. Now, the word Jacob means schemer or supplanter. I mentioned that. Israel, the angel said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but it should be Israel. Now, Israel means God. Anytime you have a name in Hebrew with the word El in it, that's God. But Israel means God commands. God's in charge. Now, some of the names we read in the Old Testament with El in them. There's a name, Hiel. Hiel means God lives. Daniel, the name we're familiar with, means God judges. Gabriel, that angel of God, means God is my strength. Jacob's question to the man, the angel, was, what is your name? That was unnecessary because I think he knew who he was wrestling with. Evidenced by the fact when the angel was gone, he named the place Peniel, or facing God, or God's face. Remember what he said? I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. Face to face, Peniel, with God. When God commands, his blessings follow. You see, a lot of times when we think about God's commands, we get the picture of law enforcement or harshness or strictness. But always remember what God's commands are for our benefit, not simply because he wants to be satisfied by our obedience. And the last verse says, now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel. Isn't that a beautiful picture of praying through? He'd wrestled all night, but the sun came out. The sun rose upon him. And finally it says, and he was limping on his thigh. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us this, but I kind of feel like it could well be true. Many scholars and commentators believe that that limp was a permanent limp, that he had it the rest of his life. His hip was out of joint, and sometimes that can cause a permanent damage. In other words, the reminder of this crisis that changed his life. Jacob was never the same after this. Oh, to be sure, some of his weaknesses, he didn't become perfect. Some of his weaknesses were apparent after this, but his life was different. It was changed. And whenever we encounter God in this way, coming to the end of ourselves, hanging on, our life is changed. We're never the same. We're always dependent on him. He is our strength, not we. He is our strength. I just pray for you and I that God will help us each to learn in our lives not to depend on our own strength, not to do it our way, but to walk with a limp. Thank you for joining us this evening.